In this lesson, what we're going to do is talk about the role of the church within Christian practices. Now, as you can probably imagine, the church is a very, very important and seminal institution for the different varieties of practices and doctrines that takes place within the religion of Christianity. Now, we're essentially going to be talking about the importance and the role of the church, specifically within the context of the local Christian community. And so, in that context, what we have to do is talk about the different roles that are performed by the church on the one hand, and then on the other hand, talk about how those roles are important for Christians around the world. And we're going to begin by looking at the concept of rites of passage. And the concept of a rite of passage is the marking of some kind of event that really gives us indication as to the transition of one individual's life going from one phase to another, the transition of one's life from one phase to another. And that is what is known as a rite of passage. And within Christianity, there are actually a number of specific instances that are considered to be rites of passage that can be noted. And what is interesting about the church within this is because for our purposes, the church plays a very key role in each of these different traditions, in each of these different rites of passage. Now, as such, what we're going to do is talk about these rites of passage and talk about the different ways in which the church plays different roles within each of them. And the most important of these are the concept of baptism, the rite of passage that you do very early on in life for the most part. Marriage, which is something that tends to take place sort of in the middle of one's life with another individual, and then towards the end of one's life, unfortunately, we have to then think about the idea of funeral. And these are all rites of passage that you will probably be very familiar with. Some of you have probably been baptized and have been to weddings and funerals as well at the same time. And you should note that within the Christian practice, the church is very, very seminal in each of these different events. So beginning with baptism. Baptism on its face is just the process that takes place when an individual is to be cleansed from sin. The practice itself, of course, just like many other practices that we have looked at, will differ depending on the different Christian denomination. So, for example, within the Roman Catholic tradition, as well as within the tradition of the Church of England practices, an infant will have water poured over their head. This water is from a font and it is blessed. And the process is to represent the cleaning of one's head, in the sense that it is also going to represent the cleansing of one's soul, the cleansing of one individual from sin. However, when it comes to other practices, so for example, more orthodox practices, it is not just a little bit of water poured over a child's head. The child is actually immersed in water fully. I'm sure they don't particularly enjoy that particular process. And then the question really that we have to think about is that within some Christian practices, within most Christian practices, in fact, baptism is something that takes place very early on in life. Hundreds and hundreds of years ago, baptism would take place almost straight away because there was this belief that with the connection of baptism and early child mortality, that you'd have to get baptized as quickly as possible because it was otherwise a sin, otherwise to not. So if we go back to sort of medieval times and early modern periods in history, you'll note that when a child is born, it is almost like they are born and then straight away rushed to get baptized. And this sort of links to all of these ideas that we know already to be things relating to child mortality. Children were more likely to die either in infancy when they were much younger, when we look at the sort of medieval periods and stuff. And that's one of the reasons why that is the case. But even today, there is this belief among the majority of different Christian denominations that baptism is something that should take place when an individual is very, very young. It is taking place when you are an infant or when you are or a toddler. Now, this is not to suggest that within Roman Catholic traditions or within Church of England practices, you can't be baptized as an adult. If you want to convert to these Christianities, you can do. And of course, if you're an infant and you haven't been baptized, that's hardly your fault because you don't really have the choice of whether or not you're being baptized. So you can be baptized later on in life, but the tradition is generally that you are baptized when you're an infant. However, when it comes to Baptist churches, there is actually a rejection of infant baptism. They argue that the biblical evidence for baptism shows that the idea and the practice itself was a choice that is made by adults, not something that is forced upon without the consent of children. So, essentially, in this regard, you will be baptized if you're an adult within the Baptist church doctrines. Moreover, we also have this idea within more nonconformist churches, just such as the Baptist Church, that there is a practice of the believer's baptism. And in this practice, an adult will ask God for forgiveness for their sins and will commit themselves to Christianity. And when it comes to the believer's baptism, the individual will often wear white to represent that particular practice. Confirmation is another aspect of Christian practice that is often very much influenced by the role of the church within the local community. Some children who are baptized when they are very, very young will make the decision to show their faith and renew their commitment to Christianity later on in life. So this is known as a ritual of confirmation. And specifically within these specific denominations, so within Catholicism, within Orthodox Christianity, and within the Church of England, as well as within Methodist Christianity, confirmation is a ritual that performs this role, the role of being able to show your faith and renew your faith in Christianity later on in life, even though you have been baptized when you were a child. And when confirmation occurs, individuals will usually take part in a class that is run by the church itself. And here the person will learn more about the nature of faith and the nature of commitment to God and all of the different kind of things that you would tend to learn anyway when you go to church, but specifically relating to this idea of confirmation and this idea of renewal of commitment. Within the Roman Catholic tradition, confirmation is often associated with the bishop who will place oil on the forehead of the individual who is going through that process. Continuing on then, if we look at the sort of middle period of one's life, we talk about the idea of marriage. Now, the celebration of marriage is another example of a rite of passage within the Christian church. And the practice of marriage shows the love and commitment to another person under the eyes of God. That is the general presentation. Now, this is not to suggest that that is traditionally how marriage has been conceived of from a historical perspective. Marriage was a situation or a tool that was used by those within power to assert a certain amount of power in that regard. So those, for example, monarchs would marry their children off to the other royal families of Europe as a way to solidify relationships between those states and also to maintain a certain amount of power and authority over those states as well and over those particular royal institutions, which is why if you go down the royal family trees, you will see that all the different intricate connections that exists across all of Europe. That is traditionally what marriage was used for. It was a tool, a political tool by individuals. But from a Christian perspective, marriage is not a political tool. Marriage is the showing of love and commitment to each other under the eyes of God. At the start of a wedding, the individual adjudicating the marriage, the vicar or the bishop, will explain the purpose of marriage, and then they will ask if anyone knows any lawful reason why the two should not marry. That tends to happen all the time, and I think most people know that particular aspect. And then the parties to the marriage will then read their vows to each other. Wedding vows are essentially a commitment of exchange when it comes to the eyes of God. Now, some people may choose their own wedding vows. Some people may opt for a certain set of wedding vows themselves, a template. Sometimes it's quite awkward to try and write and wax lyrical about the particular love and affection you give to another person in front of everybody in a marriage situation. So it might be easy just to read out a pre-made template. The parties will then exchange ring. Again, the rings are another symbol of commitment to each other that they wear for the rest of their lives. And specifically, if we look at specific denominations and how these practices differ, within Orthodox Christianity, the exchange of rings is done at an engagement before the wedding takes place. This exchange of rings that is done before is known as a betrothal ceremony. Equally, the rituals at the betrothal ceremony are repeated 3 times as a way to represent the symbolism with the Holy Trinity. Again, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. All of these things are all very symbolic. They all interlink within the Christian doctrines. And for those who don't know, we have lessons on that already, the idea of the Holy Trinity. And then during the wedding itself, a silver crown known as a Stephana will be held over the heads of the parties. This is within Orthodox Christianity, by the way. So those are just some of the ways in which, firstly, marriage takes place as a rite of passage within the Christian practice, but also the ways in which it can differ in certain different denominations of Christianity. And we took a case study here of Orthodoxy. Finally, then, we have funerals, which are the less positive counterpart to that of a marriage. And the funeral marks the final rite of passage for a Christian individual. And this is the celebration of one's life after death. And it can also act essentially as a reminder of a believer's faith in the afterlife, because if we go to a Christian funeral, there is this very heavy semblance of religious symmetry and religious imagery as well. We have these ideas of the afterlife, of the rite of passage into heaven, of this relationship with God. All of these things are to give a reminder and a renewal of an individual's faith in the afterlife itself. Again, of course, there are differences within different Christian denominations. Despite this, we can come to a general conclusion that there are commonalities across all of them. All denominations will have readings from the Bible generally. There will be a eulogy, and there will also be prayer. So we know this to be the case, that there will be prayer, readings from the Bible. The Bible has lots of different passages that relate to life after death and relate to the concept of heaven and the afterlife. We've done lessons on this already. Eulogies, again, readings and speeches essentially about that individual, often by close family members or maybe by very close friends, to be able to do a eulogy. And then prayer is, as you can probably imagine already and understand what prayer may be.